All right, well, another edition of the Chiefs Straight Talk segment. We've done it for a little bit better than a month now and have gotten some tremendous feedback on some of these spirited conversations on timely matters. And I could think of probably nothing more timely than some of the matters that we're going to discuss this go-around. Before I do, I just want to kind of set the table here and let you know who we've got on deck this go-round. All the way on the far left over there, without the tie, the button down, Gene Trombini. He's an analyst, actually, with the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department. Real good with numbers, real wonky guy. Interesting stuff, though, and we're going to hear from Gene in just a second. In the middle here is our guy, Chief Putney, Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department, his segment, and you'll expect to hear a lot from Chief Putney today on an important issue. And closest to me, but farthest away from us geographically, is Dr. Frank Baumgartner. For those of you who don't know Dr. Baumgartner, he's a political science professor from UNC Chapel Hill, kind enough to make his way all the way from Chapel Hill to join us for a very important topic of discussion that we're going to have when it comes to stop data, police stop data when it comes to car stops. Dr. Baumgartner put together a study back in 2015, just pulled a lot of data, a lot of stop data from the state, and came up with the conclusion that African American drivers are stopped at a disproportionate rate, far more than their white counterparts. So what we're going to try to do today is we're going to try to keep it to just about a half hour. That's the way that this kind of thing goes. That's the rules here. We're going to try to stick to that. We know how valuable time is. What we don't want to do is get too caught up in stats and decimals and numbers because we know we could lose an audience quick. So what I'd like to do when we set the table is maybe have Dr. Baumgartner just give us a couple of minutes of what some of his bigger findings were in that study.
Yeah, well, thanks very much, and thanks to the Chief for having me. It's a pleasure to engage in this important conversation. Back in 1999, the state of North Carolina was actually the first of all 50 states to mandate collecting traffic stops data. And they mandated that for the State Highway Patrol. And then it was expanded to basically all except the smallest police departments in 2002. So North Carolina's been collecting this data based on a lot of concern, particularly among the Black Caucus members of the General Assembly back in the late 1990s, and it was a national concern about this concept of so-called driving while black.
Yes, sir.
And the allegation or the concern at the time was that a particular drug interdiction unit in the Highway Patrol may have had a statistic that they were searching black drivers at twice the rate that they were searching white drivers. And so at the time, the legislature came together and said, this is an important concern. Either it's a valid concern and we'll fix it, or it's a scurrilous allegation against the men in blue. So we've been collecting the data. But no one ever analyzed it. This surprised me to no end. The law actually mandates that the Attorney General give periodic reports, but no report had ever been given. So I was asked to volunteer to figure out how to analyze this massive database, and I just completed a book where we pretty much validate the concerns that motivated the legislation. African American and Hispanic drivers are significantly more likely to be pulled over, about twice as likely compared to white drivers, and when they are pulled over, they're about twice as likely statewide to be searched as a result of that traffic stop.
So these are stories we've heard for decades. The numbers actually affirm what the
numbers affirm what people might suspect, and it's ubiquitous. It's not peculiar to North Carolina. It's not peculiar to Charlotte. It's in the Department of Justice investigation of the city of Ferguson, Missouri. After the events there, they found something similar. The numbers for Ferguson are about typical for the state of North Carolina. Mm-hmm. So it's a national issue. There's no question about the patterns. They're particularly targeted at men rather than women, and younger men rather than older men. We don't collect data in North Carolina about the age of the car, but if you drive an older car, that's an indicator. And it depends a lot on the time of day.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
At 2 o'clock in the morning, you're going to get searched.
Yeah.
at rush hour at
Yeah.
7 in the morning, it's very unlikely. The traffic needs to keep flowing. So,
Would it be fair to say that your conclusion after gathering all this data and analyzing all this data, that you identified a systemic issue with racial profiling in law enforcement?
I've identified a systemic issue of disparities in outcomes. The concern about what's causing that, I think, is weak. That's why we're having this conversation. I know the numbers, and I know what the numbers demonstrate. They demonstrate very different outcomes. As a matter of fact, I have a student who is working on a master's thesis where she compared, and this was for the state of Illinois because they have a little bit more data, Asian Americans, Hispanics, blacks, whites, and Native Americans, males and females, younger people, older people, and older cars and newer cars. And the odds of a traffic search of an Asian American woman over the age of 50 driving a relatively new car is about 0. But the young Latino man with an older car has a 20% odds of search.
Sure.
Charlotte has numbers around that level, 20% odds of search for certain demographic groups, and you can guess that that's young men of color.
So you
About a
don't, you don't
20% search rate, and that's a high search rate considering the statewide average is 3.
you don't overtly make that leap that it could be systemic racial profiling. You don't discount it either, but I would suspect, and it's actually some of the comments I see and some of the feedback that the study has gotten. A lot of members of the community feel that that's very much at play is systemic racial profiling, especially in law enforcement.
I have to say that I'm not a police officer. I respect the work that the officers do. They have to make split-second decisions. But whenever we look at things that are visible, each visible cue has a predictable impact. So that Asian American little old lady with the nice new car, she's not, that's all visible. And when we have in states where we know if it's an out-of-state plate or an in-state plate, that out-of-state plate leads to a predictable increase in suspicion. So, of course, the police are looking at people and making judgments about their behavior, but also their identity is one of the things that the policemen can't stop themselves from looking at. And it does have the impact that people are concerned about.
Now, Gene kind of peeled back some of it, to really get some context around the numbers. 85,000 car stops, give or take, in 2017. That's the latest data that we have for last year. What were some of the big takeaways that you came across in your assessment?
I think the biggest takeaway is we're in strong agreement with you that disparity is in fact there. And I think you hit the nail on the head that the question now is what is the cause of that? And profiling is certainly one of those potential causes. That have others, and spoiler alert, we actually think there are some other things causing it. But we took a look at the SBI data just for the Charlotte-Mecklenburg area to see if there was evidence for that profiling hypothesis. We took a look at sort of night-day stops. The stop rates are very similar. Actually, 52% of black drivers are stopped between the hours of 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. So you're looking mainly nighttime hours where it's very difficult to tell the race before you pull that car over. We also took a look at having cause to search a car. So obviously if you're profiling, you don't have a legitimate cause to search a car, and yet 70% of black drivers who are searched, there's probable cause in place compared to 56% for white drivers. So our officers are searching.
And for those at home who may not have a law degree and understand the distinction there between probable cause to make a search and not having probable cause to make a search, what does that mean to the person at home, Gene?
Sure. Probable cause, you need to be able to articulate your reason for searching a car. That needs to be there. You can't just go on a hunch. There needs to be something in place. If you wanted to go on a hunch, you could ask to search a car. That would be a consent search. But those are occurring much less frequently. Whereas, if you were profiling, that's what you would expect to see. You would have to go with a consent search, but that's not actually the case. But really, what is the point of searching? It's to find something. And so you would expect in a profiling hypothesis that if all you are using is an illegitimate reason to search a car, that it's the person's race, you should not be finding anything, or at least not at a very high rate. In fact, the rate of finding a contraband after a search is nearly identical for black and white drivers. Despite searching, the search rate is certainly higher, like we've talked about with the disparity. But officers continue to find it's, not to get too much into the numbers, but it's 44.94% of the time for black drivers and 44.99% of the time for white drivers, despite being searched much less frequently. So the numbers, they're there, and again, we don't disagree with the disparity. It's just the evidence that it's profiling is where we're kind of getting hung up. And really, I think, and I'll let the chief speak to this more than me, it's where our officers are taking more officer-initiated activity. We do analyses to see where our crash hotspots are and where our violent crime hotspots are, basically where our safety concerns are, and that is where 60% of our traffic stops are taking place, and it really follows that. And the amount of searches throughout the day, we can account for 90% of the variance in searches just by knowing the crash rate and the violent crime rate.
Well, Chief, folks in Facebook land at home, let's say, come on, 2 and 2 is 4. Does disparity equal discrimination?
No, I think that's the whole point of it. And again, Doc, honored to have you here to really delve into this. What we have now is the what. We're trying to figure out the why, and then the what next. And I'm talking to Doc about how we might go beyond where we are now with what the data shows and see what the next steps are, because nobody can be more concerned about disparity than I am. It's a red flag. And I innately jump to conclusions. I can't help but do so because of what you've been hearing about driving while black and everything else around racial profiling, which is why we've been so intentional about our policies. But what is interesting to me is when you look at how I deploy our resources based on the data, because what I see is black communities of color make up 52% of our victims of all crimes. And that's disproportionate. That's a disparate outcome. When I also look at the distribution of violent crime, again, the people of color are the people who are well outside their population being victims. It's 62% with black victims versus the 35% that they make up in this jurisdiction. So we have to intentionally put our people there because our mission is to prevent the next crime.
So it's fair to say that we have more staffing, more resources in areas that have a statistically higher rate of violent crime, both victimization and suspect, and those neighborhoods, unfortunately, are African American neighborhoods?
It's not just fair, it's a fact. It's by design that we place our people there proactively to achieve our mission, which is to prevent the next crime. And what I see is when you overlay the maps, you see how it correlates quite consistently. Now, does that show me empirically that race is not a factor? No, but it does give me quite a bit of comfort to see that strategically, based on how we deploy our people to prevent crime, it will inflate those numbers, so you'll have some disproportionality.
Thoughts, Doc?
Yeah, I would add one little way of thinking about it, and that is, what's the value of what we would call informally of hassling somebody? Mm-hmm. Stopping somebody based on you don't like how they look, you think maybe they're in the wrong neighborhood. And I would add up these numbers or just lay them out. We looked at about 20 million traffic stops for the whole state over 15 years. About 3% of the stops lead to a search. And that's really what we analyze, which people get searched. Sure. So given that you got pulled over, what's the odds that the officer is going to ask to look in the trunk of your car and your pockets? And that's highly disparate by your demographics. Little old ladies never get searched, and young black men get searched at a very high rate. But then how often do we find contraband? It's about, statewide, it's about 30%.
And do we reflect that kind of? Do we
We're
mirror
a little
that?
higher.
A little bit higher on the search rate and a little bit higher on the contraband rate here in Charlotte, because the state includes the highway patrol. They almost never search anybody. They're giving out speeding tickets, and so it's a diverse set of police agencies. But when you think about the 3% times 30% hit rate, and then the hit rate, when you look at what's found, typically it's that much of something. The average outcome is that the person is not arrested. So about 45% of the times statewide, when contraband is found, it leads to an arrest. Otherwise, about 55% of the time, it's either a ticket, a warning, or no action at all. That tells me that the contraband hits are not interdicting massive drug shipments.
So you're not seeing significant
It tends to be very low on the amount.
as far as contraband goes.
Oftentimes so low that the officer lets the person go with no action or just a warning or perhaps a ticket. Of course, it depends on what the contraband is. If it's a weapon versus alcohol or drugs. My point to the chief, and to just add to the conversation in the most respectful manner, and this would be true statewide or nationwide, is that young man that gets pulled over. For example, being a middle-class white male, the last time I was pulled over by a police officer was 1974.
Good golly. You're a lucky guy.
You
I
are
just got
lucky.
pulled over Friday night, so you're a lot luckier than me.
I'm a good driver, but anyway, I think there's more to it than that, having done this study. But Philando Castile in Minnesota, after he was tragically killed, he had been pulled over, I think, 49 times.
Good golly.
And he was only 32 years old.
Wow.
So in his short lifetime as a driver, he had repeated interactions. So the only thing I would like to add to this conversation is, legally speaking, according to the U.S. Supreme Court, being momentarily detained by a police officer, whether it's as a pedestrian or as a driver of a vehicle, they consider that to be a mere inconvenience. And I would agree with that if it, and certainly I would cooperate with any officer who wanted to talk to me.
Sure.
But if I was a young Hispanic male living in what's called a high drug area, which might be home, it might be where my school is, if I was a mother or father of that young man, and I had found out that for the 18th time in the last 6 months he had been questioned, I'd be angry.
Sure.
And so I think that we need to assign some kind of cost to what I've called in our book fruitless searches. Searches that come up dry, investigations that come up dry. Naturally, they're inevitable. The police can't always know exactly who's the criminal. They want to investigate. So
I love it, Doc. Again, I appreciate you being here. Here's what I'll say, too. I think there is a cost that you have to weigh. And you have to weigh that against some of the benefits, because a lot of the reason we're being driven into the areas you alluded to, it's that higher crime. And let's be honest, some of those areas have the least amount of trust already. Some of those areas have the worst history, especially when you look at the impact the police have played in that history. So I think we have to be very careful, which is why I'm looking forward to what we do beyond, once we can get our hands around the why, because ultimately your policy has to reflect that delicate balance too. I mean, if I'm going up here to prevent victims, but I'm losing trust in the manner in which I do it, I got to step back and evaluate the policies, which is what I do. But what I can tell you out of confidence right now is a lot of the disproportionality is based on how we deploy our people. But to the doc's point, what I think we should spend some time on is looking at how we can cost out that versus the benefit of protecting future victims.
Well,
I think that has to be a
go
balance.
With the proportionate model, we would only be in 34% of the African American communities, our resources.
True.
Some would argue that would be downright irresponsible.
Well, here's the issue is the demand. I told you 60% of violent crime, 50% of all crime, the victims are black in predominantly black neighborhoods. So if I said I'm going to put a quota on how many times I respond to your community based on the makeup of the population, I think that's totally irresponsible. So it is rock in the hard place. But I think the ultimate piece of why we're here, the reason we're here, is to better explain the why and how we can move forward to give some policies, give some structure, but everybody understand the reason we're there in the first place is we get the demand based on call volume, based on victimization. We respond to that. We're proactive in that. And that creates the situation that we're discussing.
How do we balance? And I know you couched it well at the beginning, law enforcement's not your thing, but that is a tough needle to thread. How do you thread that needle if you're in a position like his?
Again, I'm not an expert. I would add something a little bit different, another perspective from a political science perspective, and that is what we could observe as what I would call a racial empathy gap. I think the average middle-class white American in Charlotte or elsewhere can't get their head around the idea that one would not trust the police. It's just unimaginable. Like in my neighborhood in Chapel Hill, I wouldn't be able to imagine that a police officer would treat someone like me with disrespect or impoliteness. Indeed, it's never happened to me in my lifetime.
Sure.
On the other hand, it does happen where police go into neighborhoods much more commonly, and it's a much more aggressive interaction. And that's reality. And certainly, there's a justification for it, but sometimes. But I would pose this thought experiment to the audience. Imagine if rather than deploying the police and going in aggressively in the neighborhoods where they're going in now, what if it were flipped and they were going into the middle class and upper middle class neighborhoods and searching the student backpacks on the way to high school?
Yeah.
If that situation were flipped, those young men, mostly it would be the men that would be targeted, those young men would go to their parents and complain that the police are somehow suspicious of them. And we know that drug use is pretty similar among blacks and whites. Crime rates is definitely true on average, are targeted and concentrated in certain neighborhoods, so it's natural the police are going to target those neighborhoods. But I think we do have a broad national issue about different community expectations and experiences and levels of trust with the police, and I think that's a national catastrophe, and we really should be talking about how to solve that trust problem.
Thank you, Doc. Again, here's what I'll tell you. I think the essence of community policing is part of our solution. What we see too, beyond the stats, beyond the data that we look at and how we deploy people, we also have specific requests from community members asking for more police visibility, more activity in their area. So I agree with you, Doc, around the empathy deficit. And so I tell you, I wish my job were, here's the data, do with it what you please, really. But what I think is there's an opportunity too to be able to validate that demand at the community level. That does not, and again, the anecdotal evidence the doc is giving you, that does not disregard that at all, in any way.
Nor do you minimize those statistics.
You
You see the value there with those statistics.
But what you need to be doing too is paying close attention to the barometer of people's perception and trust level based on how much you increase the intensity by which you proactively police those. I think that's the essence of community policing, and that's how we continue as a policymaker to fine-tune what we do.
Yeah, but Chief, some at home with a critical eye may be saying to themselves, gosh, Chief Putney's really coming at this through rose-colored glasses. He can't sit there with a straight face and say that he doesn't believe there's some type of racism, maybe not necessarily here in Charlotte, maybe here in Charlotte, but across the board in the profession. That's not what you're saying here.
No, if they were listening and they can play it back, I said at the beginning, I'll never say race is not a factor. You're looking at somebody who believes and still is skeptical of the profession based on my history. But what I can say is, which is why I wanted to talk to the doctor in person, is we got to look at the data. We always have to be suspicious. We have to be skeptical. But also we got to balance that against the needs of the community and the demands, to be quite frank with you, because I have a lot of older people in communities that are most fragile who have that same empathy gap. They're still saying, I want to get these people out of the way who are causing the mayhem, who are preying upon me and my neighbors, and the best way to do that is for us to be proactive. So we got to continue to work on that. I think what gets measured gets done, and that's a huge data point that we just don't have at our disposal right now.
Well, one thing I can say is we can look officer by officer at the ratio of black and white drivers that they pull over, and then the ratio of black and whites that they search. So you might imagine a particular officer works a beat or is in a precinct that's mostly white and they encounter relatively few African Americans, or vice versa, they work in an area that's mostly minority and they encounter few whites. And you could have a fish out of water hypothesis. That is, if you see a black person in a white neighborhood, there might, why is this person there, statistically speaking, not each individual person, of course. And that only works one way. The blacks in the relatively white neighborhood, that is measured by how many blacks and whites does that officer encounter, they might be searched 3 or 4 times more likely than the white person in the white neighborhood. But the white guy in the black neighborhood, judged by the fact that that officer has a ratio of mostly encountering blacks, he doesn't pay a penalty. So that's an interesting little dynamic. It only works one way. The other thing I would add that's really easy, I think, for people to think about in police leadership positions is, what's the purpose of monitoring the traffic? Public safety, or finding a way to get into a car to investigate a person? Public safety means stopping people that run red lights,
Absolutely.
speeders, unsafe drivers, and then the investigations would be things like people with expired tags, other things that we could call poverty issues.
Well, that's a really good point.
Taillights.
And if you could, Gene, dovetail off that a little bit with, let's just take the 2017 data that you captured. The number one offense, African Americans that were pulled over, were they regulatory offenses?
Vehicle regulatory, correct.
And what does that mean exactly to the people at home?
That could be an expired tag, for instance, something of that nature.
Busted brake light?
Well, that's equipment. Yep.
Okay, so that would be an
Also
equipment
It was
violation.
equipment and regulatory, 63%.
63% of the
Yes.
time that African Americans are pulled over, it's for equipment or regulatory
About
offenses.
2/3. That's correct.
Are those not important offenses?
They're not safety offenses. Well, a broken headlight at night would be a safety offense for sure, but a slight crack. But what's interesting about them is they lead to a higher search rate. When you get pulled over statewide, when you get pulled over for speeding, your odds of being searched are very low. But when you get pulled over for an expired tag, your odds of search are much higher.
Which would lead the layman to believe that an officer's out fishing.
Well, the expired tag might be related to poverty. It could be related to many things that might in turn be correlated with some kind of criminal activity. But my point here is really that that's racially disparate. The expired tags, the regulatory thing, equipment in general, anything other than traffic safety, which I would define as drunk driving, speeding, red lights, depending on how the officer codes unsafe movement. I mean, truly unsafe movement is, but sometimes it's to the discretion of the officer what that means. If we were to focus really on those things, our racial disparity statewide in searches would go down by almost 50%. The disparity would go down because the disparity in these regulatory or
Equipment.
non-safety, non-traffic safety searches is much higher. The other thing is we're getting very few hits from consent searches. If the officer doesn't have probable cause, but he has a hunch, he has to ask, is it okay if I search? Do you mind showing me what's in your pocket, sir? I'd like to see in the trunk of your car. Would you give me permission? Legally speaking, you're entitled to say, no, you're not. Do you have probable cause? You have to give your permission. Some cities around the state have given written consent forms, and those consent forms explain your constitutional right to avoid the search, and they pretty much discourage you from signing the form. And no one
Almost
signs
acting
those forms.
as an attorney for the motorist on the front end, some would argue.
It makes it very clear that the person did volunteer their consent, that it wasn't coerced, and that can be useful in court. But anyway, my point is that we're not getting very many drug interdictions from these consent searches. They do tend to alienate people. And in Fayetteville, when there was a reform after some serious controversies and difficulties in community relations, after the implementation of these reforms and the arrival of a new chief who mandated both pulling back from the regulatory stops and emphasizing only the traffic safety, and then really limiting the consent searches, he found that calls to 911 went up. Community trust apparently increased so much that people started to call the police more, and the crime rate was on the decrease. But the relative involvement of people in the communities where the crimes are really happening was reflected in their volume of calls to the police department asking for help, even while the crime rate was going down. So I think I think there are common sense reforms that police chiefs and leaders around the country can adopt that would enhance community trust and come at only the cost of the effectiveness of those kind of fishing expedition searches. Those don't tend to be that effective anyway, so why don't we pull back from them, get the benefit of enhanced community trust without paying too much cost in terms of crime fighting? Because that consent search for the guy with the expired tags, if that's the only basis for that search, probably isn't going to lead to that much, although you would know.
Sure. Except for the stolen weapons that we recover a lot of times in those searches that were possessed illegally. And here's the other thing about the calls. A lot of times what we see is when we pull out or redeploy some of our resources, we do get an increase in calls because people are demanding our presence. So I think, though, to the other point about the written consent, we have all of our people with body-worn cameras. So in the body-worn, you can get written consent and I can coerce you into it. In the body-worn, I get all the nuances, I get the whole conversation, and then you have to articulate the why, the reason for the stop.
So for those at home who aren't familiar, what the Chief's saying here is we go beyond the written consent. When we're looking for a consent search, we get the officer to record it on their body-worn camera, the motorist either consenting or declining to allow us to search his or her vehicle.
And then you have to document the reason for that request, yes. Yes, if it's a consensual search, you explain that it was a consensual search, it was PC, you explain the PC. But all of it is captured on video so I can see whether or not it was truly consent or it was coercion. And that's I get the written, but I want to see it. And in the writing, I don't get to see that exchange. With the body-worn camera, we have that privilege.
The experience in Durham and Fayetteville and other communities that adopted this reform, and it did kind of fizzle out because it happened to be on the agenda right around the same time as body cameras became more common, and the Chief's explanation makes complete sense. It's interesting, though, when they introduce these written consent forms, the consent form says, I understand that it's my right not to consent to this search. And that's right there in black and white, sure. And it's in Spanish on the other side. And so it has led to a decline in the communities where they have adopted that reform. The declines are approximately 95%.
Wow, once they're aware of the fact that they have a right to decline.
And also the form in Durham says, oh, and by the way, here's the password to my cell phone. So it makes it very clear that this won't be just a search of what's in your hands or in your pocket. It's going to be everything in your possession. And so people don't sign that form. But the question is there a crime-fighting cost to avoiding these consent searches? And of course, if the officer thinks that he's got probable cause,
sure.
That's a different question. He need not ask your consent if he's got probable cause. And so we're only talking about the minority of searches that relate to the cases where the officer can't articulate probable cause. When I look at the numbers statewide, those searches have high racial disparity and they have low contraband hit rates, especially when you think about how much contraband was found and whether it led to arrest. Certainly there's cases
sure.
where the officer gets it right.
Chief, you're no magician. You can't look into the hearts of the...
If I could, the bigger thing for us is the vast majority are probable cause searches. Right. And there is a higher hit rate because of that. And it's pretty consistent across the races. So what I see is our people are taking the time to really develop that probable cause. We do consent searches, but I still say having it on video and then you explaining the context is still a very good way to go, so we capture that data. Yes, sir.
There's never any way, you're not a magician. You can't look into the hearts and the minds of every
sure.
one of your officers.
Sure.
Is one racist? Is this, is he policing in a disproportionate manner because of race, driven by race? But there are some, I don't want to say safeguards, but measures that we could put in place that would allow you to detect any kind of trends or things that aren't lining up properly. Can you talk a little bit about those?
We're one of 6 agencies across the country who jumped in with this study that we're doing with University of Chicago around early warning systems. We're doing a formula that shows us also, it's predictive. It shows you those officers, based on the data we're talking about, that are most likely to have that adverse encounter. So we're trying to be proactive in that work. The other big thing is we're making sure you explain the reason for the stop so that you're articulating it. And then we can measure that against all the other data points to see if you're an outlier. I think that's a big thing for us too. Our policy on arbitrary profiling is huge. We just enhanced that over the last 2 years, making sure that we're being proactive. And we also do about 1,000 a month reviews of body-worn camera, just random, 1,000 a month. That's not including those that are a part of investigation. So we got 12,000 random reviews in a year. And we're trying to be proactive because the last thing we want is truly the reason for any action by the police to be based on an arbitrary profile, be it race or gender or otherwise. So we're trying to be proactive in those areas.
You know, Doctor, somebody, and I think they captured it well, told me a while back, you know, policing is really not a science, it's more of an art that's, you know, perpetrated, unfortunately, you know, by human beings. And when you have the human factor involved, there, you know, you're going to have people who have different belief systems and things like that. Independent of some of the things that Chief just talked about, some of those safeguards that the department's employed, does anything jump off at you, jump out at you that you would recommend that police chiefs should consider in the way of trying to keep some checks and balances in place?
One of the things that struck me as the most surprising in this study was that when you look officer by officer, I actually did this for the book. We took every officer's speeding stops and asked what percentage of the time did every officer in North Carolina give a ticket for speeding as opposed to a warning. And we found that it went from 0 to 100. And then we looked at what percent of times does an officer arrest the person. And we found that the average is 0, and it goes up to 30%. And we looked at the likelihood of almost every activity that could possibly follow from a traffic stop, and we found that officers range from A to Z on pretty much every articulable standard. And so I was thinking, boy, if I was the principal of a school, and the teachers in my school were teaching idiosyncratically,
Sure.
I would make sure that there was some training to make sure that everybody was following the same curriculum. All the math teachers were teaching, you know, what was in the lesson plan. Whereas police officers have amazing amounts of discretion, and their behaviors are really disparate from officer to officer. So I feel like there really are opportunities for police supervisors throughout the country to think about what should be norms. And of course, you can always say each situation is unique. Everyone is slightly different than any other situation. But when we look, I mean, we've got officers in the state that have search rates for black drivers, and I say percent rates. So it's per 100 blacks that get pulled over, what percent of those 100 people got searched, and sometimes the ratio is 10 times higher than when they encounter white drivers. Now, I have a hard time believing that that could be explained by the underlying circumstances. So I can't do anything about it, but actually a lot of police chiefs have said, I'm going to look at these numbers. Every time there's an officer accumulates 500 traffic stops, I'm going to look at the distribution of the outcomes of those stops by race and gender, and just to see. That will allow me to identify the outlying cases, the ones that seem to be far from the norms, and then have a conversation, have his supervisor have a conversation. I'm sure you're doing that. And that's, you know, that's best practice. That's a really good idea.
That is the whole point of the early warning system. That is the EIS, and that's what it gives you, those opportunities for the outliers. And then you can drill down, you can have those conversations, you can get additional training, you can make sure you adjust policies even. So that is exactly how it should be approached. I don't disagree at all.
Okay, so believe it or not, we've gotten probably just a little whisker past our half-hour magic time here. Let's wind it up. You know, first of all, Doc, and I want to tell this to the folks at home. He and I have been on the back and forth in the email for the last several weeks and jumped at the opportunity to drive several hours just to get here to have this important conversation. So I want to preface this whole thing by just saying how impressive that is, and this is more than lip service. The guy is really a man of his word and really believes in his work, and we just have the utmost respect for you coming here like this, because it does mean the world. If you could wrap it up, though, in a couple of minutes, Doc, and I know we didn't have a heck of a lot of time. We definitely felt this was worth having a conversation that went beyond sound bites, and we hope that we dug a little bit deeper than most do, but how could you wrap it up?
Yeah, well, first I'd like to say thanks for inviting me. It's been a real pleasure, and it's really important to have these conversations. And but I think, you know, if we step back from this, I mean, there has not been a time in American history when community relations between minority communities and the police forces around the country have been very positive. There's always been fraught relations. In the last 3 years, since the Black Lives Matter movement has risen, and stayed in the spotlight, there's been relentless, almost continuous explosions of concern in this town or that town, and now every police chief is concerned about their town might be next. So I do think we have to really take seriously this question of what causes that issue of trust. Now, I've only looked at a very small part of policing, which is just vehicle stops, because this North Carolina has made available this database, and vehicle stops are only a small part of the whole picture. But they do show that there really are identifiable, consistent, ubiquitous across the United States inconsistencies in how the average Black American, Latino American, and white American encounters the police. Those things are just as real as the differences between how a man and a woman encounter the police, or a young person and an old person encounter the police, which are really different experiences. So I don't have a magic solution to it, but I think we can document that we do have an issue, and these the reasons why people respond so differently to the police, and some people trust the police and look to them as their older brothers or their protectors, and other people mistrust the police. That's a tragedy. And we really want, I thank the chief for engaging in the conversation, because he could feel defensive about it. Any police chief could end up feeling defensive about it, and I think we need to figure it out.
Well, two things. You may not have a magic wand to cure all these ills, but I think even this conversation should be a help in that regard, getting people talking, getting people thinking, the work that you're doing. You have a book coming out in July, and I don't think it's shameless to even give you a plug here. What's the name of the book, and when can we expect to see that?
It's called Suspect Citizens, What 20 Million Traffic Stops Tell Us About Policing and Race, and it'll be published by Cambridge University Press this summer. So
it'll be out this summer, and you said it, probably not a lot of contemporaries of Chief Putney who would probably touch this issue. A lot of them, when they hear about your study, they go running the other way. It's almost the third rail, this kind of issue. Chief, you got a lot of credit for even broaching the subject, and I know you have some impassioned thoughts about it. If you could wrap it up.
I do, just briefly. First of all, Doc, I appreciate it. This is the what. This is the data, the why. And what we're starting to do is do additional research. We want to be able to tease out and look at the anomalies, but tease out exactly what we see and how we perceive it. We're doing some work already on a study to show when you can perceive that race of that car, of that driver in a car. And we're getting some very telling data back. The data set's pretty small, so we got a lot more work to do. We're doing it with those who've graduated from the Citizens Academy, because as a community, we want our community to tell us how to police them. That's the whole essence of community policing. And the big takeaway, though, for me is this is step one, the aggregate. Overall, this is what we see. Step two is what we're doing now to determine the why. I told you about the where, but I told you about the policies and everything else. But ultimately, the conversation I'd like to have is the what next. Okay, this is what we see. To your point, what are the costs? We see where the demand is. We're going to have to respond to demand. To do otherwise is irresponsible. And if this is the area they're having most of the crime, this is where we need to be. But it's the how and the what you do while you're there that we're going to continue to analyze and discuss.
And you know what? I'd argue and say it's got a lot to do with the who as well.
No doubt.
The two men that you see in front of you are two men who are very passionate about this issue, and I have a sneaky suspicion there's going to be some future dialogue between these two passionate fellows. So thank you, Doctor. Appreciate it. Thank you, Gene. Chief, as always.
Thank you, my friend.
And we're going to cut it short. We don't want the conversation to end here. We know this wasn't a Facebook Live, but we really encourage you to send in those comments, questions that you may have, and we'll work our tails off over the coming days to get all those questions answered. So till our next go-round, take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.